Hello, ladies, gents, and NBs from all around the globe. I'm back, and this time I've got a budget mic, so hopefully the audio isn't a tragedy anymore. So, on to today's topic. I got the inspiration to tackle this topic when I watched a video of this British guy touring Nairobi. I'll show you the clip. Here it is.
Found the restaurant where I'm going to eat in. It's called Kenya Cheese. Here, it's kind of a local vibe, and I'm just looking at the menu while I'm waiting for Aggie, my friend, to arrive. And on the menu here, it has chicken, luya style, cured beef, mushrooms. That's all kind of fairly normal, but check out number 7, flying termites.
I've intentionally blocked out the channel name because I don't want drama around an individual, and the issue is much bigger than him. There's something about this whole interaction that bothered me and gave me secondhand embarrassment, and I wanted to find out why. So I started to reflect on my own experiences. I've been a tourist myself several times, and have you ever gone to a touristy place, especially these historical monument sites, and interacted with a tour guide? Have you ever questioned if this tour guide is a salaried worker employed by the body which runs the site? Or are they a gig worker relying on tips for the glorious work of retelling you a questionable version of history, and you realizing that your broke ass doesn't have any spare change? Then you slowly start to internalize how transactional the entire interaction is. Your brain is not even computing what the tourist guide is going on and on about. You pray it's over and you somehow disappear into the crowd before he requests for a tip. Then you pray that the guy doesn't starve that day because you didn't tip them. Because I have. And from this single interaction, I began to peel away into what the tourism industry is. The commodification, the erasure of cultures and actual histories in favor of catering to tourists, and, most importantly, class, and how that contradicts any notions of ethical tourism both on the domestic and international scale. The ideologically neutral way of describing tourism, according to the World Tourism Organization, is that tourism is a social, cultural, and economic phenomena which entails the movement of people to countries or places outside their usual environment for business or personal or professional purposes. And people generally see tourism as this fun thing to do. I mean, who doesn't like the types of vacations shown in these tourism ads? But as we all know, it's not just about relaxing under a palm tree while watching the ocean, is it? There's context, there's history, and it's political. The modern tourism industrial complex has its roots in the expansionist attitudes of colonial empires in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Due to the availability of print media, so-called European discoverers write about their adventures in distant, faraway, exotic lands. So this entices fellow colonizers to also adventure when steam-powered engines made travel more accessible. Then we can start to see some tropes forming. European attitudes about touring were very self-centered and racist. To quote a passage from Eric G.E.'s book, A History of Modern Tourism, travel afforded one way in which group members and the other were distinguished from each other, and this interaction of the self with the outside world allowed the European psyche to refine itself, seeking knowledge and power, but also understanding through this deliberately sought encounter with the world. I.e., Europeans are coded as explorers and adventurers, but the natives they met while on their journeys did not possess the spirit of discovery that's apparently only unique to Europeans. Then in the domestic scene, racist chads were working overtime to homogenize and simplify cultures of faraway peoples and places. They would organize world fairs to exhibit cultures and stolen artifacts of faraway countries. An example would be seeing an authentic Native American wigwam at one of these cultural appropriation fairs. In the minds of the crowds and the exhibitors, it was apparently the same experience as actually being in the Americas. Let's jump to the history of something much closer to home, the safari. Did you guys know that the word safari has Arab origins and it meant travel, going on a journey? Not a tourist journey, just a journey for trade, for example. But what we now know as safari has its roots in British colonialism of the East African region. Basically, to reaffirm their own sense of masculinity, a bunch of British colonizers traveled to the East African region to hunt wildlife for sport. Early hunting parties, consisting mostly of aristocrats, formulated hunting traditions and norms because even hunting had to also be civilized. Then because it's one big circle jerk, they write about their very manly adventures to assure the beta males at home that, quote, white hunters remain civilized in the face of primitive cultures and the savage frontier. Remember, they had othered the natives to be these brutish savages, so the natives exist in this sort of hyper-masculine context who are able to exist alongside the wild. So an insecurity sets in. To settle the contradiction and reaffirm white masculinity, they of course have to be the civilized masculine in contrast to the barbaric masculine. Moving forward into the 19th century, we have Theodore Roosevelt and his books and magazine publications, which he publishes after going on a safari to East Africa. By this time, the white safari has been successfully colonized by the British, and Roosevelt has the same American ideals that led to the colonization of the Americas. This idea of manifest destiny and the white man's burden. It was the whites' divine right to tame and exploit the land, unlike the uncivilized natives who couldn't due to their racial inferiority. To quote his book, African Game Trails, but most of the African natives are still wild pagans, and many of them unchanged in the slightest from when they alone were heirs of the land, a land which they were utterly powerless in any way to improve, i.e. these people cannot bend nature to their will, so they are subject to the whims of nature and incapable of improving the land. There's this popular notion in the West of dominating, conquering, and bending nature to man's will, instead of living in harmony with it. It's this man versus nature kind of a thing. So to Roosevelt, it was the whites who were destined to be heirs of the East African landscape, as they were intrinsically better at bending nature to their will. White man's burden. Roosevelt's disregard and infantilization of the natives, like many of his fellow ideologues, is shown over and over again in his writings about the natives. Quote, "The dark-skinned races that live in the land vary widely. Some are warlike, cattle-owning nomads, some till the soil and live in thatched huts shaped like beehives. Some are fisherfolk, some are ape-like, naked savages who dwell in the woods and prey on creatures not so much wilder or lower than themselves." Quote, "The Potters are strong, patient, good-humored savages with something childlike about them that makes one really fond of them. Of course, like all savages and most children, they have their limitations, and in dealing with them, a firmness is even more necessary than kindness." White man's burden. Roosevelt's motives for going on a safari was to also present this image of a hyper-masculine man as he later ran for president. You know, this nature versus the rugged individual masculine archetype that was popularized by the mythology of the gun-toting cowboys in the Wild West. His writings also romanticize the landscapes to be this dreamlike, picturesque, barren wilderness. You can see how the image and ideology of the African safari starts to get popularized by characters like Roosevelt. So a lot of wealthy men from the Americas and Britain go on power fantasy safaris. They would bring back gaming trophies, and of course an entire industry formed to buy and sell these items, because capitalism is gonna capitalism. Then wildlife populations decreased dramatically.
Shocking news.
So the colonizers eventually realized that they needed to carry out some sort of conservation efforts, but thought it was a good idea to displace the natives from their lands or from the reservations which they had forced them to move to just generations ago, all in the name of making reserves and conservation parks. These white men, mostly hunters, had the guts to call themselves conservationists when they were the reason this was happening in the first place, you twat. And what they effectively did was reserve hunting for the very elite white tourists who could pay very expensive fees for the privilege and convert natives into poachers. Go read this book or watch this brilliant video if you want some context and you don't want to read the whole book. So after the colonizers passed laws against hunting, they affect food sources of people whose contribution to the depopulation of wildlife was but a small blip in comparison to the Europeans who had hunted for fun and masculinity, I guess. Kinda like the climate change contribution ratios, yeah? Post-colonial governments of the East African region continued these conservation efforts. Maybe they were genuine, or maybe they noticed there is money to be made from the preservation of the safari landscapes. Either way, with the help of these governments and white visitors, A tourism industry arises to fully commodify the safari experience post-colonialism. Western attitudes about the safari are reflected and then reinforced in the media produced in their home countries and by safari ad agencies. Through the 70s to the early 2000s, we have an abundance of film I colloquially call Bushman films, which reproduce copies of the Western world's fantasies and imaginations of the African savannah. We see the same tropes as those in Roosevelt and his contemporaries' writings about the safari experiences. That is, the images of intrusive, barbaric savages, the postcard landscapes, the promise of an escape to a barren land that's unspoiled by civilization and modernity, where a civilized white individual can reaffirm their dominance against nature and confirm their superiority over the natives. To quote John Baudrillard's system of objects, when a savage grabs a watch or a fountain pen merely because it's a Western object, we find this behavior comical or absurd, for the object is not being given its true meaning, but appropriated hungrily in accordance to an infantile type of relationship involving a power fantasy. Instead of having a function, the object is a virtue. It has become a sign. I.e., in the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy, watched the world over, and you know the type of audience that would like this. The savage's encounter with the Coca-Cola bottle is an encounter with the West and civilization in the minds of the Western audience. Instead of what it really is, a native encounter with a consumer object produced from the actualization of the worst forms of monopoly capitalism, thrown away by an indifferent visitor whose tendencies will go on to pollute many more indigenous lands. But there is no humor in the second interpretation, is there? Also, King Orm is based and Aquaman is a centrist liberal. Debate me. Bruner highlights some of the language and framing used in safari ads. Quote, "Here are living remnants of prehistoric human cultures. People who still live by hunting and gathering. Here we can view the daily struggle for survival on the vast African plain and see the people and wildlife living, for the most part, unaffected by our rapidly changing society. But here the limitless wilderness with its teeming jungle and desert life coexists with primitive tribal communities. Quote, the civilized world is far behind in the land that's hardly ever been touched since man first walked on earth." So the tourism market represents East Africa as an archetypical other, a place which stands in stark contrast to the environmentally degraded nature and impoverished culture of the West, a place to escape to before going back to civilization. Then, with the image or experience of the safari firmly planted in the observer's mind, a quiet voice whispers in their subconscious, "If it wasn't for the European civilizing mission, the whole continent would be stuck in this uncivilized state. Maybe colonialism wasn't so bad." And with that, they are cured of their urge to get away from the creature comforts of civilization because of what they think lies on the other side. They also experience a greater sense of patriotism to Western ideals. I examined the safari phenomena because it's close to my experience, but the general skeletons of the tropes we've seen apply to a lot of places, especially those considered exotic by the Western world. I remember when we were going on vacation here with my parents and we went to this hotel. So we arrived in a good enough car which fits the aesthetic of wealth, right? The hotel staff was, to put it lightly, very disinterested in us. At the same time, some white tourists had arrived in a taxi. I observed how the hotel staff reacted to them, and they were very friendly and helpful, and we, on the other hand, were practically invincible. This story makes me think of those upper-class shopping centers and restaurants in town where you get the sense that they were not built for the locals at all. They are there for another demographic. There's something surreal about going to a 5-star hotel, at least by Kenyan standards, and the food you're getting is, to put it lightly, very English, like beans for breakfast. Who eats beans for breakfast? Come on, British people, come on. Heck, we even traveled to Tanzania, and there was something so surreal about seeing the food menu have prices that are listed in dollars instead of the Tanzanian currency. When an area becomes a tourist destination, it more often than not gets marginalized people fucked over, so that region deemed a tourist destination becomes a place to suit wealthier, often white tourists. The natives often become alienated from the land which they called home, as neoliberal cottage industries crop up in service of the tourists. This isn't a thing that just happens due to international tourism. Even within nation states, the marginalized people of that nation get fucked over to give room for the leisure of middle to upper class, often white citizens. In the video, when black people owned America's beaches, lectural media talks about how millions of acres of beach properties had black owners, but eventually, through gentrification and dubious legal means, got appropriated to white owners. And in Geko's video, by the links in the description, they detail the police brutality against POC and homeless people that will be enacted in the streets of New York and other cities. This was done to give these cities an aesthetic of this clean neoliberal city where suburban tourists and the upper class residents did not have to look at the inconvenience that's poverty. Go be poor away from tourists, screams the hostile architecture. If a government or investors realize that there is money to be made by appealing to the richest tourists, you have to know there is someone being fucked over in the process. This problem is even more exaggerated in low-income countries who have tourism being a major contributor to their GDPs. This is what almost always happens. Person wants to make money. Indigenous people occupy the money-making land. Convinced, moneyed, often white people that going to place X is some sort of good experience. Roll out some ads that exoticize the experience. Then the area begins to become a tourist destination. Push out the locals through gentrification. Airbnbs drive up the rent or build expensive housing and restaurants. Do land grabs or buy land for that cheap from the locals, then hike up the price. Pretty soon the locals are out of the way because the tourists don't need to see the poors. To quote a very good passage from a book by Denis and Co. Through the enclosure of the most popular beaches or the Disneyfication of urban heritage quarters across the Caribbean, tourists are insulated from the unpalatable realization of poverty. In these zones, they can photograph themselves at selfie hotspots without fear of the resentful gaze of the dispossessed. You'll often find these very well developed touristy areas, but as soon as you step out of that zone and venture a little further, the areas occupied by locals have potholes on the roads and every other side of a dispossessed community. And if the culture or the locals are the attraction, they begin to cater to the tourists' tastes and biases. So the image of the native as spread by the gaze of the Western people starts to become what the Western population believes to be what constitutes the native's existence. Their simplified fictional image of the native becomes the truth of the native. The naive, often self-centered tourists think they are getting an authentic experience of the culture, and then the locals continue to perform the very same dance to tourists who go back to tell their friends about their very authentic cultural experiences back home. Quote, indigenous identity produces itself in this way in the frame of global capital. Ancestral customs are slowly deprived of their ritual contents and are joined to the logics of the market. The market offers indigenous people the opportunity to manage their identity, to make their way of living exotic in front of the eyes of the tourists. In this context, the indigenous identity is merchandised and assigned to the dynamics of global capital. But at the same time, it represents the indigenous people as essential individuals who should be outside of commercial circuits, far away from the change. Their job is to stay original. I think you get what they're trying to put across here. That is, in the age of global capital, you seeing an authentic culture is most likely a Disneyfied performance of it, right? But the buyer is willingly buying the kayfabe, not realizing that these people are performing a culture that existed before colonization and global capital and is thus impossible to maintain it as anything other than a performance of a very simplified version of the original thing. It's a copy of a copy, yeah? It's a reproduction of the tourist's hegemonic vision of authentic culture as constructed in their mind by exposure to a repetition of tropes and symbolic images. The other reflected back at them is their own imaginary projection. To quote Eric Bruner again, Western tourists are not paying thousands of dollars to see children die in Ethiopia. They are paying to see the noble savage, a figment of their imagination.
I'm not really sure how touristy it is or how authentic the items are. Lots of local women here making the items on the floor with their hands, which is great to see. Shows a little bit of authenticity. I have to be honest, the people here are quite aggressive. I haven't filmed much of that, but most people will tell you to look at their stall as you walk past. So if you can put up with all those things, then the Masso Market's a really interesting place to take a look at the items. You just have to put up with a little bit of pressure.
How can I put it more directly? Those Maasais jumping up and down at you and selling you beads in village market are probably not even Maasai, are probably employed by a tourism agency or are gig workers and will not be moving around living the pastoral life, rejecting modernity or relying on cattle grazing for subsistence, sometimes starving because droughts hit as the ongoing climate crisis intensifies. They get paid with money and take off that costume and drop the performance as soon as they clock out. Okay, we went into so much detail about the previous points, and this part is called the price of tourism. So I'll just list a bunch of more self-explanatory things which I don't have to go into so much detail about. The nature of tourism leaves tourism towns economically stagnant on off seasons, causing layoffs of poorly paid and exploited hotel staff, in addition to leaving large amounts of empty housing units which the locals could have been using had they not been priced out. Human trafficking and exploitation of immigrant labor to work as hotel staff or in the sex tourism industry. Tourists polluting beaches and wildlife parks. Poaching in relation to the game trophy industry, etc., etc., etc. So you still insist there can be ethical tourism. I'm a backpacker kind of a crowd, you know. There is no ethical tourism under capitalism. The whole "but what about the backpackers" thing has this vibe of, but I'm only gonna consume sustainable products to save the climate. You cannot solve systemic problems with individualist solutions. That kind of thinking serves to obstruct the power relations present in the tourism industry. There's a reason I started off this essay with the story of the white British man and the story of the tourist guide. The British guy probably genuinely wanted to experience what it was like to be in Nairobi. He even got a local guide to help him with the process and didn't limit himself to just the touristy places. But I'm sure the people in the restaurant gawked at him and wondered to themselves, what are you doing here? Just as I would if I was sitting among them. To him, this is how he got to experience the local cuisine, but to the Kenyans, he did not have to be there. Like I said, there are entire industries and restaurants built for people like him, which the locals are priced out of. Then his reaction to the food demonstrates the fundamental differences he and the locals have when it comes to the culture. He could not appreciate the white or brown ugali and veggies unless he'd spent some time consuming the local food. To him, the food is alien and exotic and will be cemented as such in his mind as he moves on to the next city. To the locals, it's an everyday meal. Then we circle back to the tour guide, who most certainly gets way more money from white tourists than he gets from locals, because tipping culture is alien to us, and the dollars give you more OP powers against the Kenyan currency. To be a tourist is to have some level of privilege. If most of the citizens of the country you're visiting cannot afford a plane ticket and accommodations back in your home country, there is no tourism is fair and balanced TM. And even within nation states, the fact that class inequalities exist restrict who can be a tourist. Ethical tourism can only exist in a context where there is no class antagonisms restricting who can be a tourist. If you can easily adventure in Mombasa, I can also come adventure in LA or Sydney or Tokyo or which other tourist destination exists in the Western world. No exoticization of cultures, and also there shouldn't be exoticization of cultures outside the observer's own. This would require some sort of eagle death where the cultures are not experienced solely for the observer's self-realization, but in a way which one would learn about things they did not know about, and a genuine desire to travel to places, not because of the exotic stereotypes reinforced in media, but because of non-fetishistic interests in seeing places beyond your local habitat. Also, no colonialism or the neocolonialism experienced under global capital and decolonization efforts by former colonies are successfully realized. There is also no exceptionalism where privileged tourists think, oh boy, things back at home are way better, as they gain a new sense of pride from being born in the imperial core. And also no racism, systemic or on the individual, no exploitation of labor, especially the labor of immigrants, and then the self-determination of cultures on what they choose to share with the world, and market forces will almost always interfere with this. When a white European man can go to the shores of Mombasa and not come back home with the tales of Kenya's very enthusiastic and promiscuous ladies, we have probably achieved most of what is on this list. If you have more ideas on what post-capitalist tourism looks like, please feel free to post about it in the comments. We are now entering the last section where I just dunk on very shitty tourist behavior. Cue the music. We have the tourism Johnnies and Beckies. I have already alluded to the Johnnies just a minute ago. Now I'm coming for the Beckies. I'm coming for you white women and your Madingo fetishes. This is something I've seen firsthand on the beaches of Mombasa. This very old white woman in a bikini just making out with a young beach boy. Kenya is a very relatively conservative country, so I'm not used to seeing PDA to the levels these two were showing. The young man was, let's say, caressing the white lady's bottoms with a lot of dedication. And then the dark side of these kinds of interactions is that the young women and men who engage in these sorts of things are sometimes underage and sometimes hooked on pills to cope with the job. And then the brothels that spring up because it's illegal to, they are usually branded as massage parlors, and these massage parlors are so overpriced that no locals would pay such kind of charges just to be touched with oils. But when we see the ads, we know what's going on. I had a friend of mine tell me about this Australian lady who became unstraight after visiting one of these massage parlors and getting finger and tongue action like no guy has ever given her. So this Australian lady was hitting on my friend because now she had a thing for black Kenyan women because of the experience in one of those spas. Let's say spas in quotes. Then we have the why is this culture so backwards kind of Andes. We have the I will not learn the language even a little bit kind of Andes. Then we have the I am also a native now kind of white savior kind of people, hippies. They're mostly hippies for some reason. And then we have the come gentrify these area capitalist vultures and influencers who like they go somewhere and they're like, oh my god, it's so cheap to live here and it's so nice, look at the nature, can you all come here, it's so cheap, and then they just effectively gentrify the fuck out of the area. Then we have the travel and hotel companies. Just eat the rich. Oh, thank you for your patience and your listening skills. I'll see you in the next one. Yeah, bye.